What's going on, guys? Billy here, and if you've been around on my channel or if you've been flying drones for a while, then chances are you know what an ND filter is. It's a tinted piece of glass that goes in front of your camera's lens that allows less light to hit the sensor, thus giving you the ability to lower your shutter speed. The darker the glass is, the lower your shutter speed will have to be to even out the exposure value. These filters can sometimes be utilized by photographers. It sort of depends on the look they're going for with their photo. So if there's motion in the frame and they want to show that movement, then they're going to need to open up their shutter speed for a longer period of time, and the longer that shutter is, the more light that gets let to hit the camera's sensor, and therefore you need to compensate with the ND filter. That's where it comes into play. Now, in terms of video, ND filters are pretty much a must, especially with drones. I carry around like 2 or 3 sets of different ND filters with me inside of my bag. The reason I've got them and the reason that you pretty much always need to use them when shooting video is because you want your shutter speed to be double your frame rate. So let's say we're shooting 4K video at 30 frames per second. Well, our shutter speed will need to be 60. If we bump that up and shoot 4K video at 60 frames per second, then the shutter speed has got to be 120. I didn't make the rules, but this is just what looks the best. It looks best to the eye because it adds a good amount of motion blur. If we shoot 4K video at 30 frames per second and the shutter speed is like 2000, it's just not going to look right. So now that we've gone through our little crash course on ND filters, it's time to take a look at the variable ND filter made for the DJI Mavic 2 Pro by Freewell Gear. You know, before I sat down and I started filming this video, I went through all the different ND filters I have for the different drones that I own, and it's pretty crazy to think about how many different variations of ND filters there are, and these companies that make these ND filters make you think that you need all of them, when I can say that for the past 2 years, I've been using one single ND filter for pretty much 95% of the time. So we have the traditional ND filter. It's a tinted piece of glass that goes in front of your camera. It allows less light in. You can lower the shutter speed. So we already went over that, but they've also got an ND polarizer filter. So not only does it allow less light into the camera, but it also adds a polarizing filter. So it helps eliminate glare coming off of water, for example. But I don't really use that all that often. I don't find it to be that much of a help. Now, they've also got gradient ND filters, and this kind of puts 2 ND filters into one. So at the top, it'll be darker than it is at the bottom. So it'll go from like an ND8 to an ND4. And this helps if you're shooting a horizon line. Sometimes the sky will be a little bit too bright for the ground. So if you want to use this, it'll kind of help you expose your shot. But again, I use these and I found myself just leaving them back at home. I never bring them out with me. And I feel like the variable ND filter joins this group of gimmicky filters. Now, for DSLRs, I think it does have its place, and I'll kind of talk about that later in the video. But really quickly, I just want to go over pretty much what the variable ND filter does. So it should be pretty self-explanatory, as it offers a variable amount of light through the glass and into the camera's sensor. Basically, we get multiple ND filters in one, as we can change the level of tint on the glass. This specific filter here goes from clear to a value of 5. Now, I don't actually think this is perfectly clear when I brought it all the way down, but it is pretty close. Anyway, check this out. As we spin the filter, it gets darker. This means that if you need a darker filter to compensate for brighter sunlight, then you can just change it right within the filter you have on, rather than taking this one off and then trying another. This filter set is a 2-pack, so the other filter here goes from a range of 6 to 9, which I personally think that I would be using more when shooting during the day. Hey guys, really quickly, I wanted to jump in here mid-video and make an amendment to some of the information that I put in this video. I wanted to make sure that I got everything right, so I'm actually re-uploading this entire thing. I'm currently in New Haven, Connecticut, in a baseball field sitting on a tractor, so I'm shooting this portion after this entire video was pretty much shot. But again, I wanted to make sure I was giving you guys the correct info in this video. Now, with these ND filters, the numbers on the sides of them don't actually signify or identify which ND filter you're using, so it's not like an ND2 filter up to an ND9 filter, but instead these actually measure the light reduction in stops. So this goes from 2 stops up to 9 stops. So technically, you get an ND4 filter up to an ND512 filter, which is awesome because usually you'd be carrying around like dozens of filters, but instead you've got all of these filters mashed into one filter. So now I'm starting to lean more towards thinking that these filters are game changers, but at the end of the day, I think I'm gonna stick to my ND8 filter because with the Mavic 2 Pro and its adjustable aperture, I I can move that around and really dial in my exposure value. There's no need to have an ND 512 filter, although that could be helpful for photographers. But anyway, yeah, I want to jump in here, correct that information for you guys. Let's get back to the video. Now, jumping back to what we were talking about before I explained how these variable ND filters work, I'm sitting here still trying to determine whether or not they're worth it, whether you guys should go out and buy them and I'm going to use them, or whether they're going to sit over there in my pile of gimmicky filters that I never use. So with the Mavic 2 Pro, we've got an adjustable aperture, right? It goes from f2.8 up to f11, and this allows us to really control our exposure value. You can directly control how much light gets let into the camera, and truth be told, there's no difference between a photo taken at f2.8 and f11. Now, if you're going to shoot like a portrait of somebody with a mirrorless camera and you change your aperture, that's going to change what your photo looks like. So if you want to blow out the background and you want to add all this bokeh behind the subject or the model that you're shooting, well, you want to shoot at a lower aperture. And if you crank that thing up to like f11 or f22, then that photo is going to change entirely. But for me, I could care less what my aperture is at with my Mavic 2 Pro. If I'm shooting at f2.8 or f11, I know I'm going to get a great shot because I'm usually shooting a landscape or I'm shooting like a really big building. There's really no separation there with these cameras, at least not yet. I would love to be able to do that, but as of right now, it's really not something that you can do, especially with the Mavic 2 Pro. Now, there is one thing I know a lot of people will comment down the comment section, and that is, well, there's different apertures that have different levels of sharpness. So like f2.8 might not be as sharp as f5.6. And I agree, but it's not that big of a difference to a point where I'm going to make it a main priority of mine to always shoot at a certain aperture. For me, it's fine bouncing around. I would rather nail the exposure rather than get like a little bump in sharpness just because I'm shooting at a specific aperture. So getting myself back on track here, the reason that I think that these variable ND filters really aren't all that much worth it is because of the adjustable aperture inside of the Mavic 2 Pro's camera. This here is a look at my screen with no ND filter affixed to my drone's camera. Take a look at my camera values in the top right corner. I'm able to achieve a perfect exposure by just bumping my aperture all the way up to f11. Now I do need to do something to get this shutter speed down, but to be honest with you, having to shoot at 1/120th of a second isn't going to totally ruin my footage. As a personal preference, I shoot all of my footage in D-Log M, which I overexpose by one stop, so looking at my exposure value, it's plus 1.0. This allowed me to lower my shutter speed to 1/100th of a second, but I would ultimately need to use a ND filter to give me some more help. My go-to is the ND8, and the reason behind this is because I can properly expose my image while keeping my aperture somewhere right in the middle. I can then lower my aperture if I need to brighten up my shot, or I can raise my aperture if it needs to be darkened. I get a lot of room to play around with the exposure value just from this one single ND filter. Now let me rewind for a second before I wrap this video up, because I know I'm gonna get some people down the comment section saying that I shouldn't be shooting at 1/120th of a second. I should always be following that rule of doubling your frame rate. But at the end of the day, shooting a little bit over is not going to kill you. Now look, if I had no ND filter and I had to shoot video right then and there, again, it's not going to kill me. The footage is going to look fine. And that's the beauty of using an adjustable aperture. It really can help you out in a pinch if you lose your ND filter, if you just don't have it, because shooting at 1/120th of a second, again, is not going to kill you. Your footage is going to look fine. If you're going anything over like 250 or 320, that begins to kind of be borderline. But again, if you don't have an ND filter, you can make it work with that adjustable aperture. Now, my end thoughts. If this was available for a drone that didn't have an adjustable aperture, so if I could buy these for like the original Mavic Pro, then I would say yes, it's worth it, because rather than continue to land, swap filters, turn the drone on and off, all you need to do is just rotate that filter on the front, and then it gives you some room to play with. Adding that on the front is kind of like almost adding an adjustable aperture, although not really. It just kind of adds the same convenience level. Now, personally, I think that variable ND filters are much more helpful on a traditional DSLR and something like the Sony a7 III I'm shooting on right now, but for a Mavic 2 Pro with an adjustable aperture, and especially on a drone, I just don't think it's worth it. And also, there's not a lot of room to play with. Like going from an ND6 to an ND9, that's just not enough for me. I'd want something a little bit more, even though they might not be able to do that in such a small filter. So moving on, I'll probably use it. I'll probably put it right there on the front of my drone because I use an ND8 pretty much at all times already. So I'll use this as my ND8 filter, and then if I need to, move that around and play with the light from there. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think of variable ND filters down in the comment section below. And as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.